Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year 2026, our first edition of the Frankenstein chat for the new year. And this is actually edition 246. And if you're watching on video, you'll see that we have, can I use the word eminent guest? But we've got a guest. Our- we've got Kathy August with us this morning. Hello, Kathy.
Hello, good morning, both of you.
Yeah, yeah.
Morning.
Happy New Year.
Yeah,
Yeah,
happy New
happy
Year's
New Year.
all around.
Yeah, yeah. And Kathy and I, our paths have crossed a little bit in the past, and we met up again. I think it was last year at a conference in Manchester Airport, and it was great to meet Kathy again. And I'm really pleased she's been willing to give us an hour this morning to sort of chat about stuff. So, Stan, how are you?
Fine.
No
Considering
illnesses,
I
no
spent the
aches.
the break over the Christmas holiday, I've managed to have a couple of hospital appointments. So I've had tube up my nose and viewed my own
Oh
throat
yeah.
working, and had a barium meal to swallow to check my swallowing. And the outcome, which Jill finds hysterical, is they may refer me for speech therapy.
Could she have advised on that many, many years ago, Stan?
But it's something to do with swallowing. It's the problem
Right,
is sore throat, and it's to do with swallowing. So he seems to think that speech therapy can help me swallow
right.
better.
Well.
But it was fun.
Let's see how this develops. And yeah, thank you, Kathy, for joining us. Can you just give us a little summary of quite an extensive career? Varied is probably the better word rather than extensive, but varied career that you've had.
Oh, well, bless you, Frank. But yes, extensive. You'll have to look in the mirror to see that it's extensive. In fact, it's just over. I'm in my 51st year of working as an educator in the
Right.
public sector.
Wow.
And I began teaching. I then did a number of headships. I was also director of two local authorities responsible for education and also a sort of associated areas. And I finished working in the Multi Academy Trust, the beginning, the very one of the very first Multi Academy Trusts, when I ran the first academy that it opened, which was the Midland Moss side in Manchester,
Yeah, yeah.
and it was the old Juicy High School, which was quite infamous, and we turned it into Manchester Academy, and it was very wonderful. And since about 2014, I've been working independently, and I, like Frank, had a number of hospital visits for different parts of my anatomy, which I will not detail.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think were you around then, Kathy, when Manchester Council agreed to, in effect, rebuild the secondary school estate, or was that
Yes,
after
that
then?
that was I was in the academy, it just opened, and they decided they'd do that by having this sort of public-private ownership thing in terms of the academies. Um, and interestingly, I was the only academy in the city, and I can remember the DFE saying, "Has anybody rung you to ask, if you can advise them?" No, nope.
I sometimes feel like this. I don't know. It's not the irrelevance of it, but you think, well, some. I was in an academy yesterday where actually the head teacher's been appointed as an HMI, and I'm a sort of interim CEO. And she asked me whether or not, with quite an extensive experience around Ofsted and inspection, I think, but whether or not anybody had bothered to, contact me just for not to make a big thing of it, but just a little bit of advice about it. Can I run this past you in confidence? And I mean, it made me reflect on the fact that there are a few people like me as well, with a few years behind us, and no one's done that, and in a way it feels quite sad that this sort of body of knowledge that you have is disposed of, that was for that time, as if it can't translate into today.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a big thing about the importance of phronesis, the practical wisdom that can collect and aggregate in people. And that one of the problems I think is that with systems is where people lose the institutional history, the
Yes.
developmental history, and you get a new new ideas. Well, they're not new ideas. And it can actually be much more cost effective and speedier and helpful if you're just able to avoid a few glitches, which
Yes.
people with paranesis could advise on or
Mm.
could suggest, not
Yes.
even
And
advise.
actually, that advice or those suggestions, they can be ignored.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, at the
But
end of the day, if it's a
Yes.
confidential discussion about something, it's as if the walls go up about
mm,
projects, and as if to say these are now our projects, and we don't want anyone to chip away at the corners of them. And they're quite happy to sort of, in effect, blindly go down a road. I suppose they're not blind. They view themselves as sort of, they've got wide-angled lenses, but actually, I think many of us can see problems occurring months, if not years, in advance. And and,
Yes.
and I think we're going to talk, aren't we, Kathy, about you're going to raise after Stan's thought about what's called our right about the possibility of mat inspections. And it'd be really interesting to get your take on, where that expertise in terms of construction of that framework or that approach, where that expertise really rests, and whether or not it's in the inspectorate or whether it's outside of the inspectorate.
Mm.
And I suspect most of it is outside of the inspectorate. But anyway,
aren't
Stan.
we all aren't we all partly to blame for that bit that Frank that nobody wants to know because you're long in the tooth as far as they can certain because as new heads, young heads going into school, did you really take full account of the old member of staff who was due to retire, or were you just glad to
Yeah,
see them off? Because I
yeah.
think I think there's a predetermination in us to say, "No, I'm sorry, mate, but we're talking modern stuff now." When really, I'm not sure there is ever been any modern stuff.
No.
If it was, we'd have solved things, wouldn't we?
But in a way, it sort of made me feel. You've reminded me when I was at the co-op as the CEO there. We had an education director who was a bit longer in the tooth than me, but he'd got to a point where actually I'm going to just say this
Mm.
because I think it could really help you. And actually, younger members of staff viewed that as a real
Mm.
challenge to my leadership. And I was in effect. There were times when it hurt listening to it, but more often than not, I took his advice or I reflected on it. And there is this sort of sense of, you I wouldn't say younger, but some members of staff view it that, you should be always right and that you should know where you're going. And actually, more often than not, I have no idea really where I'm going or where I was going. I was just trying to follow my beliefs and my principles and just try and keep as close to those as I could. But actually, sage advice, from that colleague, you know,
Well, Andy Hargreaves used to say when we were talking about school improvement, turning schools round and phrases like that, that the one thing he wanted people to do was talk to the longest serving member of
Mm.
staff and get a history of the school, the highs and lows, what
mm,
they remember, what they don't, what's gone by the board. And without that, you can't really make the next step forward because you don't know where the school's been.
yes,
I think that's really
yeah.
important.
Also, I think for members of staff that have stayed, particularly schools that have had a bit of a troubled past,
Mm.
Mm.
the fact that members of staff have stuck with it, and actually understanding their reasons why they have stuck with it is really important in gauging where you think that school actually is. And it goes back. Well, we've completed the circle now, isn't it? That is, the loss of this history. I mean, it's just a problem. Anyway, Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, I was once again looking at the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I just find fascinating. Which, for those who don't know, it's basically, and I'll make this very crude, it's when people are too stupid to realise that they are stupid. Um, and it happens at all levels. That so people who think they are much better than they are. And the other side of it is people who, with fairly high intelligence, often underestimate what they're capable of, and therefore don't apply for roles when somebody without their intellect applies for them because they don't realise they haven't got the intellect for it.
Yeah.
Well, that was the Dunning-Kruger effect in a very, very short form. But while I was reading about it, I came over with something called survivorship bias or survivor bias, which I understand, but I'd never heard of it described like that. And the example that was given to sort of give it why it's called Survivor is the American Air Force in World War II were researching aircraft um, where they should armor them more to stop them getting shot down. So every aircraft that came back, they analysed all the
Right.
holes, all the bullet holes and everything, and decided where the most bullet holes were, they would put a little bit of extra armor. Until one of the designers said, "You're not looking at the aircraft that have lost. You're looking at the aircraft that have survived. So what you're actually seeing is areas of the aircraft that can afford to be shot." And so they'd looked at the wrong thing. In other words, they needed to look.
Yes.
And survivor bias is only looking at the successful end of a set of data. Um, and I was intrigued by that. And so I thought, well, how does that bias how could that come into education? And so what I normally do now is ask AI what its thoughts are. And I just loved that the first thing we build policy for winners. Most education policy is shaped by people who did well in school, people who went to university, people who now work in government, universities, and inspection bodies. These people are survivors of the system.
Mm.
That means we design a system by those it works for. So we get more academic routes, more testing, more written work, more sitting still and listening, because those are conditions under which the survivors were successful and thrived. And I think that's actually saying what I've thought for a long time, but I've never had a way of expressing it. And so I asked it, because of another thing that plays on my mind, the attendance um, data that's
Mm.
I think's being misused. I really do. 3 days absence and your life's in pieces. And it just points out that yeah, that's got survivor bias in it because children who probably need the support most don't appear in that because they've already left school or they're in alternative education or they're
Mm.
not likely to get the results, not because of absence, but because of all other factors, especially if you're in challenging situation. And it just strikes me that we need to look at those outcomes and the decisions that are made, and more importantly, the way other people are interpreting that data to say, schools must, we must, attendance is everything. When actually it says here, so inequality becomes normalized, blamed on families, blamed on effort, blamed on cultures, instead of being recognized as a design flaw in what we do.
Yeah.
So we don't investigate the children who don't exist on that. I don't know, and I've not seen the full report, whether we ever looked at the children who still don't get results, even though they attended 100%.
Yeah.
How they balance against that? What about the children who didn't attend very well but did get good results?
Yes.
Yeah.
How does that work in a system where we've now got a one-liner that virtually says, well, if you miss school, you're finished?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
There was
I found it very interesting. So,
I think when I was working for the Northern Powers Partnership, we did some work we were very closely linked with the Manchester universities, and there's a professor who's now retired who looked at the grade profile of students who didn't get their maths or English, and tried to work out what that impact was for them. So really looking at probably not your sort of non-attending, very, very low performing students, but looking at that sort of sort of vulnerable group that really are still in the education system, but don't appear to have had all the paths open for them when they've left their secondary school. And it was really revealing how many of these students actually had quite in our day, Stan, these would have been quite reasonable results.
mm,
They might not have got a maths or an English, but they got history or they got geography. And they were saying, well, hang on a minute, a lot of those subjects do require quite a high level
Yes.
of English, for example. But because they didn't get an English GCSE pass, that in effect dropped off the other eight GCSEs, in some cases, eight good passes in GCSEs. And you think, yeah, because it's all built by people who successfully passed their exams.
Hey Frank, that could be my excuse for life because I didn't get English. I got all the
Well,
other
I
levels.
didn't get maths. I didn't get maths.
I didn't
So
get maths either, Frank.
yeah. Oh, kindred
The other
spirit.
thing about survivor bias, though, is
Yeah.
people who look at people like Steve Jobs and Gates and that and say, well, they didn't go to school, so it's okay.
Yeah. Well,
And you don't look at the thousands and thousands who dropped out of school who didn't do okay.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's
Choosing individuals.
fascinating. That's fascinating, Stan. Well done. Well done.
It's when you get interested in something
Mm,
that seems it's confirmation bias, isn't it?
yes.
It seems to confirm what you think you know, even though I've never done any research really in my life.
Kathy?
Can I just, yeah,
Yeah.
because what's bemused me post COVID when schools were getting back to normal was that children had had considerable disruption, a lot of fear, a lot of bereavement. Going back into schools, they were being even stricter than they were before.
Yeah.
And suddenly they stopped attending. And everybody said it's a crisis. Well, surely if you've got people coming back who are damaged, they've had some of them will have had horrible experiences during COVID. And they're coming in where instead of people, you know, not literally perhaps,
Absolutely.
but putting their arms round and saying, socks, trainers.
Yes.
And I thought, why can't people see this is nonsense?
Yeah.
Nonsense to expect this. Because when I was in Manchester, and when we first took over there, the behaviour of the previous school was, wonderfully outrageous.
Yes.
Riding bikes down the corridor, a group of lads just going and having a basketball game because they were chilling, and all that sort of nonsense. And then when we did very, very simple things, but relentlessly applied, it was very clear that actually they began to feel safer. But when a couple would have, a meltdown and I'd see one in a corridor, the first thing I would always do is, do you mind if I just take your pulse? And they'd look at me as if I'd gone out. No, no, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever, whatever. So I'd take the pulse and I'd say, do you know, your pulse is really rapid, son. Now let me explain what's happening in your body.
Mm,
You've had a flare of temper because of the adrenaline surging around your body. And it takes quite a long time for that adrenaline to regulate itself. And by the time you'd finished saying, I mean, I've no medical training, this is mum's stuff. But by the time you'd done that for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, everyone's gone,
yeah. Yeah.
the worst thing that we could have done there was, basically grip them up and started screaming in the face because their adrenaline would have gone into further overdrive. So it's really, really, really simple
Yeah.
things that could have been done, I think, post-COVID by schools that were thinking they were doing the right thing, well-meaning people thinking they're doing the right thing. We must get them back in order. We must,
Yeah.
apply these policies strictly, which actually had the reverse effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
In
think,
my first school, it's a primary school, we had the wet flannel, a cold wet flannel that went on children's
Yeah,
face so that they went and
yeah,
then you could then talk to them once they
yeah.
first breathing. I suppose now it'd be seen as assault. I don't know.
Well, you'd always have to ask the permission, wouldn't you? Which is,
yeah,
but
Can I hit you
yeah.
in the face with this wet flannel?
Yeah. There are ways and means, though, aren't there?
Kathy, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, it was the MAT inspections, the possibility, 2027, so pretty soon.
It's
Um, and all I've done is read the journalist's interpretation of the
yeah,
DfE press release. But it's something that I've argued for a while, and along with a lot of other people, about, this is a huge amount of public money. It's a public service. Therefore, it should be, the people organising it all should be subject to some sort of regulation, or at least to be looked at and reported back to the public. And so I had a look through what they're looking at, and there's so many questions that come to mind. Firstly, who's going to do it? because I don't believe there is anybody in Ofsted. They might have run trust, but running a trust is a very different job to running, for example, a local authority department or a big organisation that has got more than one lever and more than one area
Yeah,
to improve on. Whereas with the trust, it's education only. So it's will the aggregation, for example, of the school of their academy judgments on quality of education contribute to the overall trust one? Now, yeah, you might say that's a sensible move, but there are questions about that. And what about the alignment of vision and outcomes? Because we have trust boards who are saying one thing about their academies, and then we're hearing about behaviour policies, etc. They're saying something
yeah,
completely different. The governance and leadership area, I think, is a fascinating area. And it's what evidence can be used to, and how will it be interpreted to determine if that's right, if that balance is right, and not being sidetracked by, well, I'm strategic and this is operational. Because I spend quite a bit of time watching some of the post office inquiry.
yeah,
And I was really struck by the number of the board chairs who would say, "Oh, well, that was really operational for the executive. We were much more strategic." And there was one set of witnesses were a couple of governance professors from Oxford. And when asked that question by one of the KCs about the separation, they said, "It is ridiculous to try and separate the two. You cannot be strategic if you do not have
yeah,
proper insight into operational matters." And I think some of the trusts do not, quite
yes,
honestly.
yes,
Um, the same with welfare. Will it be an aggregation? Or will it be a separate judgment? But the really critical thing, in addition to governance, I think, is the resource use. Now, for me, that begs the question, is it going to be a value for money judgment? If it is, how do you determine what trusts are expected to do? How are you going to determine the difference between some trusts that were early to be set up, who still have quite a lot of benefactors donating money? Absolutely marvellous,
yes,
and why
yes,
shouldn't they? But how can you make a judgment about a school-led trust, which came after 2010, in terms of their use of resources and linked into their enrichment opportunities, their welfare, etc. So I'm glad I'm not got the job of writing this, but I'll be fascinated to see how it's done and who's going to implement it and what are the sorts of procedures for after the event, because we know that there's going to be at least one and probably more challenges to the first set of judgments that come out.
yeah, definitely, definitely.
The value for judgment, value for money judgment that we used to make in the early days of Ofsted. I remember an HMI saying, because I was saying, well, how do we make that judgment? Well, he said you take the cost per pupil and the outcomes overall, and then you take a giant leap into darkness and pull an answer out of the hat.
Yeah,
Because
Pretty much.
yeah,
but
And there are models, there have been models around for other organisations
yeah,
that can be adapted and adopted for maths. But it's whether or not the people doing that, as Frank said, will be willing to learn from those other organisations, or whether the refrain will be, yeah, but education's different.
yeah, we're
yeah.
different.
There are two things for me. The National Governors Association they have a sort of an award system each year for its best mat or best small mat or whatever. And so one of the academies in the co-op, the one in Stoke, went for that award without realising that if you're part of a bigger trust, you can't go. It has to be the trust
Yeah.
that go for the award. So suddenly I found myself in this sort of award system, not really wanting to be part of the award system for fear of what it would find. But three officers from National Governors Association visited the co-op for 2 days and interrogated, loads of stuff. And I found it it was a very rigorous process. And but one of the things that it highlighted were the inadequacies of the school inspection system,
Mm.
because I cannot see how a school with a massive deficit can actually, be considered to be a safe place to send your children.
Mm.
And so inspectors don't look in school inspections at anything to do with the budget,
No,
or
that's right.
whether or not the trust system of which they are part of, whether that's robust. So in effect, I think the problem here will be, I think the MAT system, whatever they devise, will start to lean into school inspections. So I could see school inspections changing to accommodate the MAT system, to provide evidence for any inspection of the MAT, so that would come through the school inspection side of it. And the second thing is there was an evaluation, what they call MATSES, which I was asked to do a review of 2 of the years for Forum Strategy, and I have to say, they were not. It was not a robust system.
Yes,
Mm.
yes.
So anything that if you lean into and get too much support from the sector, then you'll lose some of the bite that I think this is for. And my final point is, if they got that right, that could be, in terms of the MAT inspection, that could be a really important trigger for reducing the amount of inspection undertaken within the trust. So we could actually focus much more on the centre, which could then be used as a trigger point for further inspection or not, for the degree of confidence that we have. So I think the sector would view that quite positively, because I think most of the MAT sector is done reasonably well. And it's really trying to find those outliers. So I think there is some benefit in it. But as you say, who's going to do it and how it's going to impact is probably the most important question now.
And if you look at the models that have been used with FE, that's very different again and more longer. And also, when I was in local authorities, you had the corporate performance assessment,
Yes, yes,
and that was that, is this authority giving its citizens good value? And they came in and out for about
but
4 or 5 weeks,
yes,
and that was really rigorous as well. They followed tracks through, and I think for me, if you get the MAT inspections right, then the school inspections should reduce dramatically and perhaps should only be, a themed inspection
yes,
across somebody's math academies. I think we can do without the the difficulty that inspections cause, because for some heads, of course, they're not heads like we might have been heads. These are people who've grown up in one system, only
yeah,
know one way of doing things, and don't have the autonomy or the responsibility, or they might have the responsibility, they haven't got the autonomy
autonomy. Mm.
to
Yeah.
to put things right because that's held somewhere else. And, is there a trust that's apparently doing really, really well, but they're actually holding back, although it's not quite transparent, 20, 25% of monies.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think the word
Abs-
you used before, Frank, is really important, the outliers, because I think inspection as a whole should start by looking at the outliers and not necessarily blanket inspection, let's say, of all schools. But
Mm.
let's start by looking at those that are somehow very successful or somehow very unsuccessful, and do some analysis on that rather than blanket inspection. Imagine how much you could cut the cost. And then maybe in schools, we should start looking at outlying children
yeah,
and how what affects them. Why is one child done so poorly? Why is one child done so? And I mean, the analysis of that will have to include their home background, the support they get,
mm,
etc., their language, all those things that we know have a massive impact on children's development. And yet, does anybody do that kind of full
yeah, yeah.
analysis?
But I think
Don't
that,
think
that
so.
I've gone down this community theme, and actually I was talking to a head teacher of a primary school yesterday and her senior leadership team, and I said, has the accountability system and the framework prevented you from doing more to support other schools locally? And they are
Yeah.
supporting other schools, but it always got back to, but actually these are our children, you know.
Mm,
And I felt like saying, yeah, but this is our society.
mm,
And actually, I felt as though the accountability system, where it looks at an individual institution, prevents those institutions from doing what is morally the right thing to do for their community at times. I have to add that. And actually, I think the issue for me is, in the mat inspections, you know, how inclusive, how supportive, how helpful is that mat to all its neighbouring mats and all the local authority schools that aren't part of the trust? You know, how is that viewed? Because if that's the rationale for a successful mat, that's a very different place from, well, what are the results like in your schools?
Yeah.
So I think, as Kathy was saying, I think, this is fraught with danger, difficulty, and actually philosophically, is the government clear about where the focus for this work needs to be? Because it could be easily hijacked by the sector.
Well, it's also the sector itself is so atomized,
Yeah.
really. And the role of influencers in the sector, I'm not going to mention any names, but we know
Mm.
about
Yes.
influencers
Yes.
generally, can create such damage because they're very, very heavy on influence
Mm.
and mostly very, very light on knowledge, understanding, and experience.
Yeah.
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 And it's not a good mix.
No, I
Can I
fully
say
agree.
this is very rare in one of our chats, but it's as if it's been planned. Because the thing for me, what I was going to raise was this thing about something in a book, something written by Neil Jurd, who's been a guest on here twice, and he's written this book, the leadership book. And I saw he posted something yesterday, and it really sort of struck a chord, probably because of political issues that are happening around the world, and but also sort of experiences that we've been talking about today. And he calls it false leadership. So and I quote, "I'm sometimes asked to account for the success of influential people whose leadership style is so different from the inclusive and positive leadership style that I advocate. The usual examples are self-serving politicians whose style is divisive and egotistical, or further along the same scale, dictatorial or despot-like. But of course, there are self-centered, narcissistic, and egotistic people thriving in senior positions in all walks of life. You may know some of their and the energy and impact, and that's likely to be negative. But this is the important bit. He says these people inhabit senior positions, but their intrinsic motivation is usually self-centered. They lead in order to serve their own purposes, for their own recognition, their own wealth, rather than for any greater good. And in my experience, these people do not lead in the truest sense of the word. I call this false leadership. It's presented as leadership, and it looks like leadership from a distance, but it lacks meaning, substance, and positivity. Now, I felt as though, I could feel that sort of statement in some of the conversation we've had this morning. And when you were mentioning about influencers, I suppose I've become an influencer, a critic, trying to influence something. But actually I've tried to do it in a way that is inclusive and open and accepting that perhaps I'm not always right and all this sort of stuff.
And I could never be an influencer uh, because people just wouldn't listen to me. And there's also something about a gender issue here. If you look at the education
Yes.
influences and the gender balance. But what I would like to say, or what I hope I have become, or I'm becoming, is simply an observer, an informed critiquer of what's going on around me. And when I wrote the book about the experience of Manchester Academy, I was determined not to write a top tips book.
Yeah.
Do these 10 things
Yeah, and
and
you.
it'll be fine. Now, I wrote it as a case study, a warts and all case study, to say, you go through difficult times, but you've got to just key your eye on the intention of where you're going and be prepared to think big but act small.
Mm.
And that just can carry you through. But no, I could never be an influencer because for me, it is a position that is fraught with danger because the bigger the influencer you are, A, the harder you fall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we see some of that already. People who've invested their family, if you like, in them being an influencer for the next 20 years and it all going to pot. And also because I think there's no accountability.
No.
And there can be, you are not obliged to be transparent. And for me, whether it's because of the way I've been brought up, I suppose, the values and also my own sort of belief system, but it is about being as honest as you can be. You can't guarantee never to make a mistake, never to get things wrong, and never to be unkind or, a
Yes.
bit of a bugger, really. But you can be honest. And when you look at the big things around life, the COVID inquiry, not all of that, some elements of that, but the post
Post
office
office inquiry.
inquiry is
Yeah.
the critical
Yeah.
thing. And when you look back at other examples like the Nimrod inquiry, in the 1990s, was it early
Yeah.
2000s with
Or the
Charles Hatton
water
Cave,
the water pollution down
all
in,
of
was it
that.
Devon or Dorset somewhere?
Exactly. Just if people just told the truth, we would
Mm.
save a huge amount of resource, huge amount of time. And actually, they'd be better off in the long run, the people who've had to admit the mistake.
Yes.
Yeah. I just worry that we almost at a point of, if we don't defend it more, we're going to lose the fact that honesty is important. I mean, you only have to look at what's happened in the last 2 days in America, don't you?
Mm.
To know that the official position is different from what you see with your eyes.
But look at Iran. See
Yeah,
what's happening in Iran, which isn't getting national, a lot of
Mm.
coverage, but the people there on
yeah,
an aggregated collective have
Yeah.
responded. I mean,
Yeah, there is a
see what
tipping point in
happens.
all of this, isn't there? I mean, you
Yeah,
see that in
yeah,
history continually.
without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the sad thing is the pain and the hurt and and sometimes the deaths that lead to that tipping point. But um,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, well, do you know what? I'm trying to work it out now. That's 23, well,
You'd have got your maths, Frank.
35 minutes or so. The evidence is clear, Stan, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm off to speech therapy and I failed English.
Okay, Kathy, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you
Oh, it's
so
been
much.
such fun. Thank you
Yeah,
both.
yeah, and yeah, we'd love to. I mean, we always say this to guests. If you fancy coming back again, we'd be delighted to have you. Perhaps not next week, but in a few months' time, and we can chat about have another one of these chats or just do a more focused one. But whatever it is, thank you so much for your
I
time.
appreciate it. Thank you. Been
Right,
good to do.
yeah,
Have a
and
lovely day.
yeah, and thank you everybody. We'll see you all next week. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.